en común y hay mucho que nos enorgullece profundamente de poder compartir y poder escuchar también la experiencia de ustedes como pueblo, como país, como han abordado materias relevantes que sin duda discutiremos hoy. Quiero agradecer especialmente a Linda Tepuni, a la embajadora de Nueva Zelanda en Chile, que ha sido desde un inicio una persona muy cercana, muy amable. Hemos estado en distintas conversaciones ya. También ha hecho acto de presencia en la convención, no solamente nos visitó, sino que también pudimos tener una reunión junto a ella y a los miembros de los distintos pueblos de Chile en una visita protocolar, pero también especialmente a los profesores que se nos suman a este conversatorio, que son María Bargh, así que agradecerle especialmente el interés y haber respondido con premura a la invitación efectuada hace ya un tiempo. Esto es algo que se viene gestando desde diciembre, y también le agradezco el interés y la generosidad para poder compartir con nosotros la experiencia de Nueva Zelanda, y también a Carwyn Jones, que también respondieron oportunamente a esta necesidad de poder profundizar en algunas materias. Bueno, con respecto a la falla técnica, contarles primero que el centro QUESIR nos facilitó esta instancia de poder generar este seminario a través de esta plataforma. Es bastante complejo, pero sin embargo, también quería agradecer a CIR por haber facilitado este espacio, también por poder contar con traductores simultáneos que hacen que este seminario pueda que pueda abarcar una mayor cantidad de público interesado en estos temas. Bueno, y hay un pequeño problema técnico, así que yo les pediría a todos aquellos que estén con el nombre Antonia Rivas, que puedan encender sus cámaras, porque no quedan muchos en realidad, pero estarían mal nombrados. ¿Hay uno solo o eres tú, Antonia? Para ver si hay algún...
Hay un par que queda como con nombre Antonia Rivas solamente. El resto han sido invitados que han ingresado por sus links.
Ya, perfecto.
Por sus links directos en el fondo.
Habrían dos personas que estarían, se va a distinguir este conversatorio. Bueno, principalmente la idea que teníamos en mente con invitarlos, bueno, en este sentido a María y a Carwyn, fue porque estamos en medio de un proceso histórico para nuestro país que significa sin duda la oportunidad de debatir y por qué no, de incorporar materias que para los pueblos indígenas y especialmente para el pueblo Rapa Nui son fundamentales. Son demandas que se han venido durante mucho tiempo impulsando, debatiendo y luchando para que esto se materialice en la legislación nacional. Pero ahora tenemos una oportunidad con la redacción de una nueva constitución para nuestro país que podemos de alguna forma encauzar todas estas demandas de manera unida y de manera también responsable con el resto de lo que se solicita a nivel país. También me gustaría contarles que por primera vez los pueblos de Chile están presentes en la toma de decisiones y en la incidencia de asuntos políticos de gran relevancia, lo cual es un cambio paradigmático a nivel país, no menor, y por eso estamos los 10 pueblos de Chile, dentro de ellos el pueblo Rapa Nui. Y bueno, como Rapa Nui, para mí era fundamental poder incorporar a este debate toda la experiencia, no solamente de nosotros como pueblo, sino que lo que significa ser miembros de una cultura polinésica que compartimos mucho en común con otras islas como Nueva Zelanda, como Tahití, como Hawái, como Rarotonga y muchas más. Por lo tanto, yo me siento con una tremenda responsabilidad de incorporar a la cultura polinésica en este debate y a lo que significa también vivir en territorios insulares, con todo lo que eso implica y con una cultura viva. Hay mucha similitud con respecto a lo que ha podido avanzar con sus complejidades sin duda, con sus aciertos y desaciertos de lo que ha sido la experiencia del pueblo Maori, y por eso pensamos nosotros como Rapa Nui, también con mi equipo, de que iba a ser muy enriquecedor poder escucharlo a ustedes. Y además decirles que mucho de lo que ustedes han podido avanzar, por ejemplo, con respecto al Tratado de Waitangi, al Tribunal de Waitangi, a los reconocimientos de la naturaleza, de los derechos de la naturaleza, escaños reservados en el Parlamento, son cosas que hoy en día estamos discutiendo en las distintas comisiones temáticas, que es la forma en que hemos dividido la discusión de este proceso constituyente. De hecho, hoy en día, hace muy pocos minutos, se acaba de aprobar en general, que estamos muy contentos ahí con la ANTO, estuvimos siguiendo ahí la discusión, se acaba de aprobar, por ejemplo, el derecho, la propiedad indígena, que es un tremendo avance para lo que significará sin duda otras demandas como restitución territorial, como autonomías territoriales indígenas y como también el reconocimiento de los tratados históricos, que tiene mucho que ver con lo que se aprobó hoy día. Entonces, sin más, quería contarles que el seminario lo hemos pensado en 3 bloques, el primero de los cuales nos gustaría poder profundizar con respecto a la experiencia de Nueva Zelanda sobre el Tratado de Waitangi y por qué no del Tribunal de Waitangi, y después poder continuar con los derechos de la naturaleza y con todo este tremendo avance que ha significado poder darle derechos a la naturaleza, y que es algo que nosotros estamos discutiendo ahora en este proceso, y los escaños reservados en el Parlamento, que también se ha discutido mucho en la Comisión 6, que es la comisión que incorporará finalmente este mecanismo. Pero no quiero extenderme más, me gustaría también aprovechar a saludar a la embajadora, agradecerle y que bueno, ella pueda dar sus palabras inaugurales de bienvenida. Maururu.
Maururu, Tiare. Ina mana, ina reo raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Estoy encantada de estar aquí con ustedes hoy en este conversatorio. Y orana ki akwe te tawana mo Rapa Nui, señor alcalde de Tero Edmonds. Tēnā korua, Dr. Jones y Doctora Bargh. Un saludo muy especial a la constituyente y nuestra amiga, Tiare Aguilera Hey. El tema de este seminario, que es compartir la experiencia de Aotearoa Nueva Zelanda en nuestro camino con respecto al rol y el lugar que juega el pueblo Maori en el tejido político, económico y social de nuestro país, es muy pertinente. Nosotros acabamos de conmemorar el 6 de febrero la firma del Tratado de Waitangi entre representantes de la corona británica y una cantidad significativa de jefes maori de todo el país, uno de los cuales fue, de hecho, mi ancestro. Este camino continúa hoy para desarrollar y fortalecer un real acuerdo entre pueblos, un acuerdo entre iguales. Ha sido un proceso largo llegar a donde estamos ahora y no hemos terminado aún de recorrer este senda. Yo sé que los doctores Bargh y Jones les aportarán conocimientos valiosos sobre las lecciones que Aotearoa Nueva Zelanda ha aprendido hasta ahora. ¿Qué mecanismos y procesos hemos tenido? ¿Qué funcionó? ¿Qué no funcionó? ¿Y cuál es la visión para el futuro? Este es un momento fascinante para estar en Chile. El trabajo de la Convención Constitucional continúa avanzando y no es una tarea fácil. La experiencia de los pueblos indígenas alrededor del mundo, desde los 4 vientos, Naho y Fa, tienen muchas similitudes. Muchos desafíos y luchas son similares, pero cada contexto es diferente, como es el caso con Aotearoa Nueva Zelanda, Chile. Sí, tenemos un vínculo especial con Chile, por supuesto, a través de nuestras conexiones polinésicas. Como el señor alcalde Edmonds lo dijo tan elocuentemente cuando visité Rapa Nui 2 años atrás, sin Rapa Nui no habría triángulo polinésico, siendo los otros puntos Hawái en el norte y Aotearoa Nueva Zelanda en el oeste. Esas conexiones se extienden a otros pueblos en Chile con los que el pueblo Maori comparte tantos valores. Entre ellos, Kaitiakitanga, la importancia de actuar como guardianes del medio ambiente y los recursos naturales para generaciones futuras. Y Whanaungatanga, el vínculo cercano entre personas o familia. La importancia de este vínculo se encapsula en el proverbio Maori o Whakatauki, Heaha te mea nui o te ao. ¿Cuál es la cosa más importante en el mundo? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Son las personas, las personas, las personas. Un valor clave del liderazgo Maori es whakaiti o humildad. Literalmente significa hacerse pequeño. No decimos a otros cómo deben hacer las cosas. Ustedes están en su propio camino, pero como Aotearoa Nueva Zelanda estamos felices de compartir lo que ha sido el nuestro hasta ahora. Naureida, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Maururu linda, Tabana, Yorana Koe. En estos momentos también el alcalde de Rapa Nui se quiso hacer presente con un saludo, así que le doy la palabra.
Yorana, Tiare, Yorana, Korua, Tatoa, Hakarongo Mayena, i te Vananga Hohonu, i te Mahana nei o Anganira. Kia orana te rangatira linda. Momore te ate kia kotou te rangatira. Aroha nui, mai te kainga i Rapa Nui. Ia koe ki te rangatira o te kainga o Aotearoa, Yorana te taimi. Claramente es así. Si el mundo polinésico es conocido como el triángulo, si sacáramos a Rapa Nui, si sacáramos este ángulo ya no sería triángulo, sería, no sé. Creo que es necesario que eso se establezca de alguna vez cuando tengamos que dialogar o trabajar para que se entienda en nuestro propio país de que nosotros provenimos de pueblos originarios, ancestrales, muy profundo en conocimiento, en civilización, en forma de gobernanza, que nos ha llevado también a cometer errores, gracias a esos errores salir en adelante y poder progresar y llegar a lo que somos hoy día. Aotearoa, Nueva Zelanda, nos ha también entregado para el mundo una lección, cómo a través de la humildad y a través de la tenacidad se puede llegar a entendimiento. Eso es lo que hoy día debe perdurar en nuestros tiempos, para hacerle entender a las personas con quien tenemos que dialogar estas materias profundas de que no hay nada que temer. Los miedos tienen que disiparse, porque el conocimiento ancestral que podemos importar al desarrollo filosófico, conceptual, religioso de un país es inconmensurable. Si tan solo pudiéramos considerar su incorporación plena y en justicia y en igualdad. Hoy día Rapa Nui tiene algunas ganancias en su recorrer con el Estado de Chile, con nuestro país, desde que fuimos reconocidos ciudadanos de la República el año 66, 1966. Un poquito más, o quizás 60 años, un poquito más de 60 años tan solo, somos ciudadanos chilenos. Antes éramos catalogados como canacas, o podríamos peyorativamente decir seres vivos en la tierra. en conjunto con los corderos y las vacas y los caballos de aquella época. Nuestros lideresas y lideratos de entonces lograron establecer de que se puede unir, se puede trabajar en justicia, se puede considerar. Fue un acto de humildad. Y así partimos nuestro primer encuentro con nuestro país como ciudadanos. Pero aún así, en el correr del tiempo, hizo falta llevar en adelante otros puntos de vista que no estaba bien en la práctica para que el citadino, el ciudadano chileno Rapa Nui pudiese sentir en verdad esa justicia, ese querer, ese amor patria, como está establecido en nuestro tratado. Efectivamente, el tratado de Waitangi del 6 de febrero de 1840 establece 3 puntos importantes que, curiosamente, interpretado en concepto, está exactamente como nuestro tratado. Mira la relación, la sabiduría polinésica, Maori, de un tiempo a otro. Waitangi 1840, Rapa Nui 1888. 40 años después, el pensamiento era igual. Mira la hermosura, lo lindo, cómo los ancestros funcionan a través de nosotros, seres vivos, y cómo importan conceptos profundos que hoy día no ha pasado el tiempo. Si uno se lee el Tratado Rapa Nui con Chile de 1888, es como que se hubiera sido firmado ayer, porque está hablando la realidad de hoy. Al igual que el Tratado de Waitangi con el Paqueja, nuestros ancestros Maorí con ellos. Sin embargo, Rapa Nui ha avanzado. ¿Por qué? Porque nuestros ancestros, nuestros padres se han dedicado en estas décadas de recordarle al Estado de turno de que nosotros provenimos de un tratado. Nuestra relación es un tratado. Ese es el lenguaje jurídico que debemos estar hablando. Y a partir de ahí construir el lenguaje filosófico, cultural, religioso, conceptual de la unión de dos pueblos o dos naciones. Y a partir de ahí Rapa Nui ha ganado algunas cosas, algunos aspectos que han sido reconocidos, como por ejemplo, hemos sido reconocido territorio especial precisamente porque tiene una cultura especial, única connotación a nivel país. También hemos sido reconocidos en algunos aspectos por las normas. Fíjense que hay una norma, hay una ley que es conocido como la ley indígena, quizás algo parecido al tratado de Ngāi Tahu en Nueva Zelanda, el año 1997, cuando hubo un acuerdo ahí para avanzar en materias concretas del cómo llevar a la cotidianidad esta interpretación semántica de un acuerdo, de un reconocimiento de que existe un pueblo. Ahí hay un ejemplo también que podríamos recoger desde Aotearoa, ese acuerdo del año 97, que es muy interesante porque importa los materiales técnicos, lógicos para la convivencia natural de las personas y poder interpretar en terreno, en vivo, qué quiere decir esta semántica de relacionarnos nosotros, de que yo te respeto y tú me respetas. Ahí hay materias que también podríamos considerar, al igual que en el caso Rapa Nui, la ley indígena reconoce que el territorio Rapa Nui es de los Rapa Nui para con los Rapa Nui, con los Rapa Nui. Único ejemplo también, país chileno, pero quedó en la letra. No fue acompañado como lo fue el tratado de Ngāi Tahu en Aotearoa, con herramientas, con un propósito para poder ayudar a llevar adelante y hacer que las personas de verdad se sientan identificados, se sientan entonces apasionados y motivados. No fue así en la ley indígena en el caso de Rapa Nui. fue tácitamente un reconocimiento, pero nada más. En forma tibia se reconoce, y muy livianamente se reconoce el aspecto que relata el Tratado de Waitangi de respeto a la investidura, y se traduce entonces el respeto al Consejo de Ancianos, autoridad que luchaba en esa época, en los años 70, en los años 80, y finalmente fue reconocido el año 93, aquel día de octubre para el reconocimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas a través de la ley indígena. Algunas materias ganadas, pero solo quedó en la letra, y toda vez que el pueblo Rapa Nui le surte un conflicto de su propio territorio para con su usanza, se intromete el Estado y saca saca la constitución vigente como a modo de castigarnos y decirnos: mira, sométase a mí, sométase a Chile, usted es asimilado, no es incluido. Entonces, doy un ejemplo. Cuando el Consejo de Ancianos levanta una situación, una queja de los ciudadanos, ¿por qué hay que pagarle al Estado de Chile una concesión de un espacio que nos pertenece a nosotros ancestralmente para nuestra usanza? Y fíjese que al Consejo de Ancianos le cerraron las puertas jurídicas. Llegamos hasta la Corte Suprema y no tuvieron el coraje de enfrentarnos en juicio, sino más bien nos llevaron a la técnica para cerrarnos la puerta encima, y por eso el Consejo de Ancianos llevó nuestra causa a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, donde hoy día está siendo admitida como una buena causa para que finalmente el Estado de Chile tenga providencia en el caso, o de lo contrario continuaremos hasta la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Y así hemos estado avanzando. Entonces yo digo, dentro de la humildad, es tiempo que el Estado de Chile entienda de que nos necesita, al igual que nosotros, al Estado de Chile. Queremos un país, queremos pertenecer a un país, queremos ser ciudadanos de ese país, pero bajo un régimen de respeto, en justicia y de reconocimiento de que somos originarios y dueños de este territorio. Y ahora na korua tatoa, aroha tuhainanga korua, que acoe eteranga tirae, que acoe etapokie tiare, que korua tatoa. Maururu, y orana.
Maururu Tabana, muchas gracias por sus palabras. Bueno, ahora vamos a dar pie también para que nuestros panelistas puedan también dar pequeñas presentaciones a María y también a Carwyn. Y para nosotros era muy fundamental partir por el Tratado Waitangi, por las similitudes que significan para nosotros como pueblo Rapa Nui, y también contarles que quizás sería bueno introducir que nosotros presentamos una iniciativa de norma para que se reconozcan los tratados históricos en la nueva Constitución. Y eso fue defendido hace ya una semana y fue aprobado en general, lo cual es una muy buena noticia para nosotros como pueblo Rapa Nui, pero también hemos tenido muy buena acogida de otras iniciativas de norma con respecto, por ejemplo, al reconocimiento de los distintos pueblos de Chile en la Constitución, de derechos colectivos como el derecho a la propiedad, el derecho al plurilingüismo, de poder hablar nuestras distintas lenguas, de poder también avanzar en autonomías territoriales indígenas como entidad territorial, y también la creación, algunos mecanismos propuestos para la restitución de tierra, y un tribunal y el pluralismo jurídico, que también son grandes hitos en este proceso constituyente. Y bueno, y los dejo sin más para que podamos hablar sobre el Tratado de Waitangi, sus implicancias, y también el tribunal, que es un mecanismo muy interesante que también se está discutiendo en este proceso. Así que me gustaría quizás partir con María, después darle la palabra a Carwyn, ¿sí les parece bien?
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koe Tiare, nau I karenga mai kia tātou katoa, Linda, me Edmonds, te rangatira o Rapa Nui, huri noa kia tātou katoa, tēnā rā koutou. Kia ora everybody. Carwyn and I thought we would just begin initially. We've divided our presentation up into the sections that you were interested in. But we thought we would begin by introducing ourselves, as is our custom. It's a lovely pleasure to be here, lovely to meet you all. I understand Carwyn already knows a few of you, but lovely to be here to discuss the issues. Would you like me to share my screen, or is somebody else going to be sharing our presentation? Me? One moment, please. Okay.
Now you can, Maria.
Okay.
Your co-host.
I'll try again. So we thought we would begin with a map of Aotearoa, and I've drawn some rudimentary circles and a square about in the areas where Carwyn and I are from in terms of our whakapapa Māori. This is the marae that I'm from. I'm from Te Aroa Ngā Te Awa, Ngā Iwi, ko Ke Aroa te marae, ko Horohoro te maunga ki konei, me Pōkaitu te awa. So this is marae that I'm from, which is in the central North Island of Aotearoa.
O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, tautoko ahau ngā mihi kua mihia ki te rōpū nei ki a Tiare, ki te rangatira, te mea, ki te māngai, Linda, tēnā koutou. So my name's Carwyn Jones, and I'm from an iwi called Ngāti Kahununu, and from a place called Wairoa, and here's a picture here of the Wairoa River, which is really central to us. So my marae is Takitimu marae, and my hapu is Ngai Te Apatu. Tēnā koutou.
So as you indicated, you're interested in these three particular areas. We're going to go briefly over each section, and so that there's plenty of time for questions at the end. We wanted to begin by just briefly setting out the context, mostly for comparative purposes, that we begin from. The Māori population is approximately 17% of the overall New Zealand population, and we have different sized tribal authorities. And so some of those can gain greater traction in direct negotiations with the government, and the smaller tribal authorities can't usually gain as much traction in political negotiations. So we just thought we'd set out that context to give you an idea of the variation that we have in our tribal authorities across the country. We do have a couple of national political organisations which liaise also directly with the government. The Iwi Chairs Forum is one of those, but it doesn't have a specific legal standing, and it doesn't include all of the different tribal authorities across the whole country. It has some particularly powerful ones, but some of the smaller tribal authorities are not included for various reasons. So that makes things a little bit uneven sometimes. We also have Māori councils which have had varying degrees of success over the years. and are also set up by a particular piece of legislation from back in the 1960s, so aren't independent. Well, they're independent to a certain extent, but not fully independent of government processes. In terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, some of you may already be familiar with much of this history, so I won't spend too long on this part of things. Suffice to say that in 1835, we had a Declaration of Independence. The context for that at the time was that Māori were engaged in international trade, particularly across to our neighbour to the west, Australia. And for part of those international transactions, the vessels that went into the ports required a flag from their state. So part of the motivations for Māori leaders at that time was to have vessels that could have a flag on. And so there were also British folks who were here in Aotearoa creating some trouble, if you like, very eager to get hold of land and up to other sorts of unsavoury business. And so Māori were quite keen to delineate who was in charge in Aotearoa. So Busby, who was a British resident here at the time, meant to be looking after and to a certain extent controlling what the British settlers, well, British citizens were doing here at that time, facilitated and assisted with that declaration. 5 years later, we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, which had these three different components. The first was that it allowed for the British to establish a government, Kāwanatanga. The second part of it, we point to a lot as most key to us, guaranteed or reaffirmed Māori tino rangatiratanga, self-determination, and that was full and exclusive rights to lands, homes and treasures. And the third kind of key article of it was that it provided Māori all the rights of British subjects. So there were those three aspects. That sounds fairly simple, but there were, of course, two versions in two different languages, English and Te Reo Māori, and they were also different documents. They guaranteed and set out different rights. So that's been one of our difficulties, is the different understandings that have arisen from these two different versions. New Zealand has an unwritten constitution, but the Treaty of Waitangi is one of our core foundational documents that, with a number of other documents, kind of forms this unwritten constitution, if you like, and Parliament assumes sovereignty or is supreme in Aotearoa and makes all of our key legislative decisions. But the Treaty of Waitangi is still part of the foundation of our constitutional arrangements. Yeah, so for each of these mechanisms, we're going to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses. So for us, one of the challenges with the two different versions of the Treaty of Waitangi and Te Tiriti o Waitangi is that successive governments have refused to accept that Māori didn't cede sovereignty. In the English language version, there was a cession of sovereignty there, but in the Te Reo Māori version, we retained that in our tino rangatiratanga. So that difference is quite significant. We have had the Waitangi Tribunal and numerous other bodies point out that Māori continue to have tino rangatiratanga, and in a report a couple of years ago, the tribunal said Māori did not cede sovereignty in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but the Crown still insists really on their understanding of it. We also wanted to point out here, in the Te Reo Māori version in Te Tiriti, the word taonga is used, translated as treasures. And for us, this has been really important in that it's enabled us to discuss matters which are tangible and intangible. Talk about the things that are highly valued to us in both of those categories. So that has meant that radio frequencies and access to TV, for example, has been part of our understanding now of a treasure and a taonga in Te Reo Māori. So that's created potential and leverage deriving from the wording in Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Kia ora, I'll pick up and talk a little bit about the Waitangi Tribunal now, as as a mechanism really for monitoring the application of the treaty. It was really interesting to hear Tiare mention earlier the important recognition of historical treaties, and the Waitangi Tribunal for us really provides a mechanism to monitor the application of the treaty itself. The tribunal was set up in 1975, and it has a jurisdiction to hear claims based on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. It's an important mechanism because the treaty itself hasn't been recognised as being independently legally enforceable in the courts in New Zealand. So while it's broadly recognised as being part of our constitution, a foundational part of our constitution, it hasn't been recognised as providing independent legal enforcement through the normal courts. And so the tribunal provides a forum that can hear claims based purely on the treaty itself or the principles of the treaty. It's not a court, it's a standing, what we would call a commission of inquiry. So it operates a lot like a court in many ways, in that it hears evidence and argument from lawyers, but it doesn't then make law as a result of that. It makes recommendations, findings and recommendations to government, and government then can choose whether to adopt or ignore those recommendations. In order to bring a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, the claimant must be Maori and must allege that there's been some breach of treaty principles that's by the Crown, by the government, which has led to some prejudice to them or the group that they belong to, or all Māori. And so this doesn't deal with that there are no treaty obligations through the tribunal on private citizens. The claims are always against the government. And what is treaty principles are not defined in the legislation, but the tribunal is required to look at both language versions, so both the English text and the Māori text of the treaty, and determine what those principles are. The courts have also had some input into defining principles in applying legislation, which I'll come to in a moment. But the principles that the tribunal and the courts have developed largely stem from kind of key principle of partnership, or acting reasonably and in good faith towards one another, but also ideas of active protection, so that the government has obligations to actively protect those things that are covered by the Treaty of Waitangi. As is on the slide here in terms of strengths and weaknesses, you can see here that it has provided an avenue for Māori to bring issues directly based on treaty principles to attention, and to have findings and recommendations made on those. But it is because the tribunal can only make recommendations, often the government will choose to ignore those recommendations which it doesn't want to implement. The tribunal has heard claims based on both historical issues, including often large-scale land loss and loss of control of natural resources, and from the 19th century onwards, going back to the signing of Te Tiriti of the treaty. But it also hears claims based on contemporary policy issues as well. So there have been claims around, as Maria has mentioned, the radio spectrum and the allocation of that around Te Reo Māori, Māori language, and recently there's a claim around the government's response to the COVID-19 epidemic, in particular the rollout of the vaccine program there. In terms of the historical claims, this tribunal process, claim process, then led to the development of a treaty settlement process, whereby there are direct negotiations with the Crown in order to settle those historical claims. And I'll go on to talk a little bit about those now. So as I say, this is a kind of systematic process. It developed from the claims from the tribunal, and then through the 1990s and sort of by around the mid-1990s and into the late 1990s, we saw the first couple of settlements of a more systematic process. And the government set up some parameters by which there'd be a staged process of direct negotiations with the government. And the Mayor mentioned, I think, the Ngāi Tahu settlement agreement, which was one of the earliest of these settlements. Now, these settlements include these different components. They include what's often referred to as a historical component of the settlement, which includes a negotiated historical account of what has happened in the relationship between the particular settling group and the government. And that forms the basis for the government then acknowledging where there has been treaty breaches and apologising for those. And then there's a financial and commercial component to settlements. So these might be in the form of return of land. There's often very little land available to be returned in these settlements, but it might also be simply a financial package involving cash or other assets in order to provide some recognition, although it's very close, very far from full compensation, but some recognition of harm done. And the other part of these settlements is often referred to as cultural redress, but it covers a whole range of different things, including co-governance arrangements in relation to natural resources. And we'll talk a little bit more later about some of those settlements which have led to the kind of recognition of legal personality and the rights of nature kind of framework, but also a whole range of different kinds of relationships, specific relationships with different government agencies. So often the Department of Conservation, Ministry for the Environment, Ministry of Fisheries, Culture and Heritage, those kinds of agencies that there might be ongoing relationships with and new relationship instruments set up under these settlements. We might just go to the strengths and weaknesses then of the settlement process. As I say, one of the really useful things that we have found for coming out of the settlement process is that it has led to some quite innovative forms of redress, including rights of nature, which we'll talk about later. And they do provide an opportunity for the particular group that's in negotiations with the government to sit down and talk about issues that are of particular concern to that group and to try and find some mechanisms to address those. But on the other side of it, the financial component and the value of these settlements is really quite small. It's generally valued at less than about 3% of the value of land that was lost in breach of the treaty. So it's a very small commercial component. There are some constraints around what land is made available to be used in settlements and to be returned. And so that is also of great concern, because often the thing that the community wants most is for land taken to be returned. And often that's not possible because of the constraints that the Crown puts on the process. And the other part of it is that ultimately these settlements are political agreements. They're not like going to court and having your rights recognised and enforced through a court process. They're what is politically acceptable and to be negotiated by both parties, to getting to an agreement that's politically acceptable to the government on one side, but also can be accepted by the settling group as well, in terms of settling all of their historical claims. So if we, now just the other part that I wanted to touch on briefly here is thinking about other ways in which treaty principles have been recognised in law, and we do have lots of examples of treaty principles being included in legislation. And I'll just really put up some examples on the slide there, so you can see there are some different formulations which require different levels of enforcement or active application by government. So probably the strongest formulation there is in the Conservation Act, which requires the legislation itself to be interpreted and administered to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. But you can see also there are other formulations there, so that people, for example, under the Resource Management Act, people who are exercising powers and functions under that act need to have particular, take into account the principles of the treaty in that context. So that's a way in which the courts have been able to apply treaty principles. So I mentioned that the treaty itself hasn't been recognised as being directly, independently enforceable in the courts. But of course, if there's a reference in legislation to treaty principles, then that does enable the courts to apply those. So maybe we'll just go on to the next slide there, Maria. Yeah, thank you. So as I say, it does provide for some legal leverage, but you'll note that the treaty principles are referred to there rather than the actual terms of the treaty itself. So that tends to water down what our understanding of tino rangatiratanga, our authority that's guaranteed, that tends to get watered down in terms of the way the treaty principles are applied. And often too, you can see the way in which the courts are willing to engage in applying those principles in legislation is usually quite a process-based approach, so that it might require the Crown or the government to take into account treaty principles, but ultimately the government then is left with a decision about what is consistent with those principles or not. So that leaves some scope really for them to set that framework. Okay, I think that's all from me on my bit there.
That must bring it back to me again. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the reserved seats that we have, the different Māori electorates. And we thought that we'd put here just a map indicating roughly where these 7 Māori electorates are, to give you a sense of the geographical size really that members have to navigate. So there are 7 Māori seats at the moment out of 120 in our House of Parliament, and they map on top of the general electorates that we have. So to go back, these were established in 1867, and at that time the purpose for them was a little bit different. Some would argue, as I do, that it was part of an assimilation tactic at the time. Māori were busy in the mid-1800s with their own unity movements. There was a Māori parliament which had been established, and so part of the sort of origin of these reserved seats was to draw Māori from their independent political organisations and the Māori Parliament and the Kingitanga movement that had been established, the King movement, to draw these into the settler parliament that had been established. So there's sort of mixed feelings really about the origins of these reserved seats. Over the years, however, their purpose and role has shifted a little bit, and now we see them as a minimum form of recognition of Māori treaty rights. But as I say, they've got a bit of a mixed history in some ways. Once we in New Zealand changed our electoral system from the first past the post to a mixed member proportional, a system of proportional representation in 1996, what had been originally just 4 seats finally was able to increase with the number of Māori on the Māori electoral roll. So we have 2 electoral rolls. So those on the Māori electoral roll vote for those who are candidates standing in the reserved seats in Māori electorates. And Māori can also choose to be on the general electoral roll, and so vote for candidates in general electorates. So we've got these 2 electoral rolls there, but when we, and they'd been pegged essentially at 4 Māori seats from the 1800s, But as I said, when we changed electoral systems, they were then able to shift according to how many people on the Māori electoral roll. So for us, the number of Māori people on the Māori electoral roll is very important. And I think I've got that on the next slide about some of the limitations of that. You can only change once every 5 years, which is a bit of an impediment. So we have 7 Māori electorate seats out of 120. There are 2 ways in New Zealand to get into Parliament. Either you win an electorate seat, whether it's a Māori electorate seat or a general electorate seat, or you come in off the list, off a political party's list. So there are those two ways of getting into Parliament. So there are 7 Māori seats, but the number of Māori people in the New Zealand Parliament is 25 at the moment. But again, there are only 7 Māori people in there who are representing Māori constituents. And so often we have discussions, people who are usually opposed to reserve seats point out, well, you've got 25 Māori people in Parliament. We don't need the Māori electorate seats because you already have plenty of representation in there. So it's really important, I think, to always emphasise that actually it's still only the 7 Māori electorate seats that are specifically representing Māori constituents alone, rather than a broad number of people. So there are a number of issues with the Māori electorates. On the one hand, they are, there's some recognition there of a Māori tino rangatiratanga, you could say, Māori self-determination, and that these just exist, reflecting our rights stemming from the treaty. But on the other hand, there are sort of quirks of the system which mean they probably aren't able to be used to their full power. So one of these is that one particular political party has dominated the Māori electorates over the years. That's the Labour Party. In fact, from 1943 to 1996, they were the only party that was elected into the seats. So that domination has left certain legacies throughout Māori electorates. In 1996, when we changed to mixed member proportional, changed the electoral system, that enabled smaller parties to get into Parliament. And at that time, a party called New Zealand First, which had a lot of Māori members, sort of swept through and took out all the Māori electorates at that time. Also, with the change in electoral system, there was a flourishing of smaller parties. But over the years, that's changed, and we've sort of returned now to a dominance of much larger parties, and that's for a number of reasons we can talk about if you're interested. There is a minimum 5% threshold for parties to enter Parliament, and that's been a bit of a barrier to Māori political parties, independent parties that are wanting to contest the Māori electorates. The Māori Party, so we do have a Māori political party, they have managed to win an electorate seat in the last election. They have in previous elections before that as well. And because of the way that our formula works, we now have 2 members from that party. So one who's an electorate representative and somebody who's come with them off their party list. Not all political parties stand candidates in the Māori seats, and that's partly because many of those parties have policies to abolish the Māori electorates, and they are vulnerable. The rules around Māori electorates sits within the Electoral Act, and so and they're not entrenched. So a simple majority of Parliament could abolish them at any time, unlike the general electorate seats, which are entrenched and require a 75% majority in Parliament to make any changes with those. So there's a vulnerability in the way they're set up. We also have issues, as I mentioned before, with the Māori electoral roll. At the moment, Māori can't just swap electoral rolls when they like. They must wait every 5 years, which is timed alongside the census, or when they enrol to vote. So there's some restrictions there which really frustrate Māori voters. We also have reserved seats at a local government level that I wanted to talk about, because this really allows for a more decentralised system. So we have central government and local government in Aotearoa. And all local governments at the moment have the opportunity to establish Māori reserved seats, we call them wards, at the local level. And they're also required under the Local Government Act to include Māori in decision making. And that's Māori tribal authorities that are in their areas, not necessarily just through the Māori ward reserved seat system. We've had some challenges with this over the years, but last year there was an amendment to this particular act, and now 45% of local governments have Māori representatives. And so again, like at a national level, these reserved, or these electorates map on top of where there are general electorates. So I've given you an example here from the Bay of Plenty, just again, the sort of scale of these electorates. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, one of the major weaknesses and challenges is that some within local government don't believe they have treaty obligations to Māori. So their understanding of why they're looking after Māori interests or including Māori in decision making comes back to a very liberal democratic understanding of ensuring that those who are in the community have representation and voice at a local government level, which is quite different from the sort of guidelines that we have at a national level, or the expectations that Māori have about being a treaty partner. And Carwyn talked about that emerging as one of the key principles derived from the Treaty of Waitangi, is this idea of partnership between the Crown and Māori very much are thinking that when they're engaging at a national level and at a local government level. Māori representatives on local governments are commonly outnumbered, and usually that's either one representative of say 14 or 2 out of 14. So it's very difficult for them to advocate for Māori interests. There are also some tensions when there are Māori representatives on local government, whether it's in a reserved seat or not, that may be from other tribal areas. And again, that's a complexity thrown up from this, alongside this partnership idea, I guess, because those who are in different tribal areas may not have the mana or the authority to really be speaking about the natural resources and how they should be used or developed in those areas according to tribal authorities. We also have a resourcing issue. So again, tribal organisations are regularly engaging with local governments about natural resources and proposals to exploit or develop those. But those tribal organisations often don't have the funds really or the people capacity to be engaged in that. So it's a real struggle for them to maintain that.
This must be back to me. So the last thing that you expressed an interest in hearing about was about some of the rights of nature discussion and the way that that's being applied here in Aotearoa. And so I've got 2 examples that I'll talk to you about. Te Urewera, which used to be Te Urewera National Park, and then Te Awa Tupua, which we used to refer to as the Whanganui River. Now, important to recognise that both of these recognitions of legal personality came out of a treaty settlement negotiations in both these contexts. So these were negotiated arrangements that are now implemented through legislation, but they do try to address the specific issues of the tribal groups that are involved in each. They have slightly different mechanisms in each, but they both recognise legal personality. So we now have a situation where Te Urewera, the kind of forest, if you like, is recognised as having its own legal personality. There's a governance board which is jointly made up of Māori and government appointments that makes decisions in the best interests of the forest, of Te Urewera, and is able to speak on behalf of Te Urewera as well. And the same works for Te Awa Tupua, although there are slightly different mechanisms there in place, but it enables a governance body to make decisions in the best, well, it requires that decisions are being made in the best interests of Te Awa Tupua itself, and enables a governance body to speak on behalf of the river. So the legal personality part is really just a component of a broader shift in relation to the governance of both Te Urewera and Te Awa Tupua. So the legal personality part addresses that, most specifically, a question of standing, so that it means if the forest is being harmed in some way, or if the river is being harmed in some way, then there is a body who has automatically the ability to speak on behalf of the forest or the river, to bring litigation if that's necessary. So whereas previously you might have had to find a person whose own interests were being harmed in order to have standing to bring that case. Now there's no question of that. The legal personality addresses that. But it also fits within a wider framework of shifting the way in which everybody relates to those aspects of the landscape. And I'll probably focus more on thinking about the mechanisms in Te Awa Tupua, but there are similarities in the way each of them are set up. But Te Awa Tupua now has in its legislation a set of values by which anyone who is undertaking any function or exercising any powers of regulation in relation to Te Awa Tupua, which is the whole river system, must now give effect to those values. And those values are taken from, in the legislation even, they all start with statements, traditional statements from the tribal group involved about their relationship with the river. So most famously is the statement, ko au te awa ko te awa ko au, so I'm the river and the river is me. So that statement is included in the legislation, and then there's an explanation of what that means in terms of understanding the value that's to be applied in the governance of that river. Importantly, one of the key concerns that the Whanganui iwi, the group involved, had through their settlement was that they had been trying for over 100 years to have their rights recognised in relation to the river. And what they had come up against was, well, they might be able to go to the Native Land Court and have some land rights recognised adjacent to the river, or maybe even some of the riverbed. Or they might be able to engage with one local authority about part of the river, and then they'd need to go and talk to another local authority about another part of the river. What this legislation does is it, and as part of the values, is it recognises Te Awa Tupua as a holistic river system, so that it's not divided up anymore, but also it's not divided up in terms of a geographical area, but it's also not divided up in terms of the different components that make up the river system. So there's the riverbed, there's the water, there's the plant and animal life in the rivers. There's even a recognition of the communities associated with that river as being part of the river system as well. And with both Te Urewera and Te Awa Tupua, there's a recognition in the legislation that these are not only kind of physical aspects of the landscape, and they don't just have a physical value as a scenic part of the environment, but they have a metaphysical or a spiritual value that's inherent within them as well, that needs to be recognized. And so the legal personality supports, the recognition of legal personality supports this understanding of, for example, seeing Te Awa Tupua as an holistic system, as involving more than just the physical components of the river system. But it's those values, I think, that are going to be really important going forwards in terms of ensuring that everyone who's involved, everyone who has a relationship with the river now needs to act in accordance with those values. And that's similar to some of the earlier river settlements. The Waikato River has similar kinds of principles underpinning the way in which the river is to be managed and who's involved in the strategy and development of the management plans for that river. Although the Waikato River doesn't have that recognition of legal personality. So I should just note, we can go on to the strengths and weakness. I was just going to note before that's all right, Maria, we'll stay on that slide. Thanks. I was just going to note that in relation to Te Awa Tupua, the legislation sets up kind of different sorts of levels of governance groups, if you like. So there's a two-person body who is going to be the human face and speak for the river, and that is one person appointed by Māori, one person appointed by government, but they are to act as the human voice for the river. The legislation also provides that they have an advisory group which has Māori representation as well as an appointment from local government. And then there's also a wider strategy group who's responsible for developing the strategic plan for managing the river, and that has membership appointed by the range of different Māori communities who have a relationship with the river, as well as local government, as well as other bodies interested in environmental management and have some interest in the river system as well. So there are different layers and mechanisms involved to manage that. Just in terms of thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the kind of recognition of legal personality, or the use of this idea of rights of nature, is that importantly, although these settlements are made with the particular group who are settling their historical claims, they're structured in such a way that they affect the way in which everyone is interacting with Te Urewera or Te Awa Tupua. And I think that's really important. So it's not just about one group having more say or more input into a process around managing these areas of the natural environment. It's actually fundamentally shifting the way in which everyone must engage as well. And it does, as I say, the legal personality aspect of it is really important in recognizing a more holistic approach of understanding the forest or the river system, as the case may be. But I do think it is important to remember that these arrangements are not, their focus isn't specifically to provide a rights of nature framework for Te Urewera or Te Awa Tupua. They have come out of specific settlement negotiations, and so they have been focused on trying to address the particular issues that have been of concern to each group or the communities involved. So in terms of thinking about how this might be adapted elsewhere, I think it's really important to understand that particular context and think about, well, what are the things that make sense in a different context to recognize rights of nature in that kind of framework as well. And that's me.
Kia ora koutou. So that's the end of our presentation. We're happy to take questions. So we left it fairly short so that you could ask the sorts of questions about the areas you're interested in.
Maururu, María, Maururu, Carwyn. Bueno, yo primero que todo quiero pedir disculpas. Soy muy mala anfitriona y es porque para nosotros como pueblo Rapa Nui es una tremenda, este momento como de poder compartir estos conocimientos es una gran alegría, y lo digo con mucha responsabilidad porque, bueno, no sé, debe estar Hetereki Juque por ahí conectado, que es un gran amigo mío de Rapa Nui. Yo soy abogada de profesión, pido disculpas por no haberme presentado con anterioridad, y como Rapa Nui, desde Rapa Nui, junto a Hetereki Juque y un grupo de amigos de Rapa Nui, siempre tratamos de acercar la Polinesia a todo lo que hacíamos en la isla. Para nosotros era uno de los grandes sueños de poder incorporar la Polinesia en todo, en la planificación urbana, en el mobiliario urbano, en la arquitectura, en festivales de cine, en todo lo que es en educación. Así que estar con usted acá, ver la presentación, y hay tantas cosas que nos hacen mucho sentido desde el lenguaje. Yo creo que el Maori es, a mi juicio, y el alcalde me puede quizás corregir, a mi juicio es lo que yo más entiendo y creo que es lo que más se parece al Rapa Nui. De hecho, cuando los escucho hablar, es muy, muy parecido. Me es mucho más fácil escuchar el Maori que, por ejemplo, el hawaiano. Así que, bueno, me presento, yo soy Tiare Aguilera Hey, fui elegida por el pueblo Rapa Nui para representarlos en este proceso constituyente. Como también les contaba, es primera vez que estamos en estas instancias tan importantes en términos políticos, pero escuchando la presentación, yo creo que hay mucha similitud con el pueblo Rapa Nui, mucha, desde el Tratado de Waitangi, con esta dualidad del documento en sí, que hay una versión en inglés, una versión en Maori. Es lo mismo que ocurre con el Tratado de Voluntades, que es el tratado de nosotros, del pueblo Rapa Nui, que suscribimos con el Estado de Chile. Los documentos no son coincidentes y se produce mucho de lo que ustedes aquí nos contaron, de que no se entiende lo mismo, de que el pueblo Maori entiende otra cosa muy distinta a lo que finalmente se interpretó a través del tiempo. Pero también esta relación especial con el medio ambiente, a nosotros nos hace mucho sentido, como cuando ustedes dicen lo que ocurre en la montaña afecta al mar, en el caso de nosotros, porque en la isla no hay ríos, pero tenemos una especial conexión con el océano. Lo que afecta en el Maunga, finalmente trae consecuencias en el océano, y eso es algo que lo sabemos muy bien. Pero también me gustaría señalar que la situación quizás de nuestro país es mucho más compleja, porque no solamente es una relación entre el Estado y el pueblo Rapa Nui, sino que aquí tenemos el tremendo desafío de poder incorporar al pueblo Rapa Nui, pero también a otros 9 pueblos que están hoy en día reconocidos por la ley, pero también otros pueblos que podrían eventualmente incorporarse, que hoy en día no están reconocidos, como el pueblo Selknam o el pueblo Chono, que es el pueblo Selknam al sur de Chile, y también está el pueblo tribal afrodescendiente, por lo cual la situación es mucho más compleja, y muchos de los mecanismos que tenemos que pensar e incorporar van a tener que responder de alguna forma a esta diversidad existente en el país. Sin embargo, Rapa Nui ha avanzado mucho en incorporar elementos que para nosotros han sido claves. Por eso el alcalde mencionaba que hoy en día ya somos reconocidos como territorio especial, pero hay mucho por avanzar, hay mucho que podemos alcanzar en esta nueva constitución. Y yo me gusta mucho cuando hablan de esta creatividad, de estos mecanismos que se crean para poder implementar en términos prácticos lo que uno demanda. Y yo creo que en ese sentido llevo una invitación también a todos, a que nos pongamos creativos. Este es un momento no para ponerse conservadores con respecto a avanzar, por ejemplo, en descentralización, avanzar en la incorporación de derechos de los pueblos indígenas que han sido mucho tiempo ignorados en nuestro país, y poder ver también lo que está ocurriendo en otros países y en otras experiencias. A mí me enorgullece profundamente haberlos escuchado, siento que los conozco, por eso quizás me salté la introducción, porque estaba muy ansiosa de poder escuchar al respecto. Siento que tiene mucha relación con lo que nosotros estamos demandando como pueblo en este proceso constituyente, Cuando ustedes hablan, por ejemplo, de los derechos de la naturaleza, nosotros estamos trabajando en un principio que nos haga sentido a los 10 pueblos que estamos trabajando juntos, tratamos dentro de lo posible de trabajar juntos a pesar de nuestras diferencias, que tenemos muchas, pero el concepto, el principio no es familiar a todos, con sus diferencias, con su terminología diversa, pero nos hace mucho sentido. Y por eso se los agradezco. Yo creo que también hay quizás una deformación de los abogados en particular, y aquí me hago responsable de mis palabras, también yo soy abogada, de quizás temerle a cambiar conceptos o avanzar o en incorporar conceptos que no son 100% jurídicos. Por ejemplo, plurinacionalidad para nosotros ha sido muy complejo de explicar porque hay mucho rechazo ante lo diverso. También maritorio, que es algo que estamos tratando de incorporar para que se proteja el mar y la zona costera y que se respete la particular relación que tienen los pueblos con este entorno, y eso ha generado mucho rechazo. Pero yo creo que es el momento para poder discutir estos temas. Siento que la incorporación de otras miradas, sobre todo de otros países, no solamente países que estén situados en el continente americano, sino que traer otras experiencias va a enriquecer este debate, y ese ha sido el principal objetivo de organizar este seminario. Bueno, pido disculpas por los inconvenientes técnicos que tuvimos al inicio, pido 1000 disculpas por no haberme presentado como corresponde. Es muy básico para nosotros los polinésicos, pero también decirles que era también la emoción de poder tenerlos acá. Ha sido muy difícil coordinar, también hay una diferencia horaria importante. Nosotros estamos ayer, hoy día y la semana anterior en proceso de votación, así que estamos muy nerviosos con mi equipo porque se están tomando decisiones. Yo lo decía con la Anto, estamos viendo la posibilidad de lo que ustedes tienen hoy en día, nosotros lo podamos tener. Entonces, por ejemplo, cuando ustedes hablan del tribunal de Waitangi, es algo que nosotros soñamos que ocurra, y ustedes lo tienen, lo han ido puliendo con el tiempo, han tenido aciertos y desaciertos en la toma de decisiones, pero nosotros recién hoy día estamos discutiendo la posibilidad de tener escaños reservados, que no es una seguridad. Estamos recién discutiendo la posibilidad de reconocer a los distintos pueblos, de poder hablar nuestro idioma. Hay un sector que es bastante conservador en mi país, que piensa que estos no son derechos, que son privilegios. Entonces, cuando uno está próximo quizás a ver esto en un nuevo documento que de alguna forma regule una relación diferente con el Estado de Chile, es bastante emocionante, y al mismo tiempo mucha incertidumbre si finalmente lo vamos a poder ver materializado. Ha sido realmente un honor tenerlo, para nosotros como Rapa Nui especialmente. Escuchar lo que está ocurriendo en Nueva Zelanda, escuchar lo que ocurre en Hawái, escuchar lo que ocurre en otras islas, nos hace mucho sentido. Creemos que este nexo fuerte cultural está muy vivo todavía, y es como lo que ocurre también con Hokulea, por ejemplo. O sea, es algo que surge, que resucita en un lugar de la Polinesia, pero que nos hace sentido a todos, y que finalmente terminamos todos sumándonos en un gran proyecto y conectándonos y recordando cómo nos conectábamos antiguamente. Así que muchas gracias por sus palabras, por sus ejemplos. Tenemos muy claro que esto no es una copia, nosotros no podemos copiar lo que ustedes están efectuando, pero sí como pueblo Rapa Nui podemos de alguna forma pensar y quizás mejorar o incorporar algunos elementos que podrían finalmente verse materializados en la Constitución. Y con esto no quiero quitarles más tiempo. Yo siento que acá hay muchas personas muy interesadas, hay muchos Rapa Nui, lo cual me pone muy contenta, muchos Rapa Nui que no vemos desde que yo me vine a Santiago. Estamos acá trabajando desde julio, el aeropuerto de Rapa Nui está cerrado. Por lo tanto, ha sido la forma que yo he tenido también de acercarme a ustedes, de poder reencontrarnos, aunque sea por este medio. Así que yo voy a dar paso a las palabras. Hay muchas que ya están en el chat, y el que quiera también hacer alguna pregunta a mano alzada, también para que se vayan anotando. Y en el chat ya había una pregunta respecto a cómo ha sido el proceso de interculturalidad y cuáles han sido las dificultades que han enfrentado en este proceso.
Can I just clarify, by intercultural process, do you mean the the relationship between Māori and the Crown, or between Māori and non-Māori? Can you clarify the question, please?
Ahí sí. Es que tenía...
Yeah. So there have been, I mean, there have been clearly different phases that we've been through. At the moment, I guess, we're at a point, Carwyn may have a different view on this, but I think we can see a lot of enthusiasm about Māori language, things that Māori are doing, and the idea of a relationship between Māori and non-Māori, not just between Māori and the Crown. You know, I teach at the university in Māori studies, and we've seen a huge growth in non-Māori taking our courses, and those students are really keen to be good allies for Māori, and so that's a change, I think, in the last 10 years really that we've seen. Before that, there was more hostility, I think, to things Māori, but now we've had a kind of momentum growing, and so that means that acceptance of tikanga Māori, which is an area that Carwyn's been leading in law circles, is becoming accepted as a source of law, if not the first source of law, and there's greater recognition of that in that area. We've had less recognition of that, I'd have to say, in the political spheres in terms of Parliament, but government agencies now have a lot of different plans for trying to partner with Māori tribal organisations, and so there's a huge kind of growth in this idea that different government agencies will have a partnership and a high-level relationship with Māori tribal organisations. So that's a little bit of a shift and something really positive from our side. Carwyn might have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Maria has said there. And, you know, we see a lot of enthusiasm now for Māori language, and mentioned the Waitangi Tribunal heard a claim in relation to the Māori language back in the 1980s. And as a result of that claim, the tribunal made recommendations, many of which the government accepted, to make Māori an official language, to establish a Māori language commission. And through the work of that commission, largely, we've seen a real huge development in the popularity of Māori language amongst non-Māori. And also with things like Māori TV as well, also having an impact there. And there is, as Maria mentioned, a real shift happening in terms of of New Zealand law recognising tikanga as a source of law. And so, you know, up until recently, I was teaching at the law school at Victoria University, and there's real interest, not just from the students, but we see the students coming through very keen to think about how to implement tikanga. But we can see that interest amongst the judges as well, who are confronting these issues in particular cases, thinking about, well, what might be the relevance of tikanga? How might the New Zealand common law change if we start to draw on some of the principles of tikanga Māori in the way in which we apply a law which has largely been inherited from England? So there are those really important shifts taking place.
Maururu, Carwyn, hay otra pregunta que es sobre el tribunal. Dice, ¿cómo se constituye? ¿Cuántos son los jueces, me imagino, quienes los eligen en relación a los reclamos realizados en el tribunal? Aproximadamente cuántas demandas se reciben al año? Respecto a las recomendaciones hechas por el tribunal, ¿qué tanto son consideradas? Y si son, ¿qué tanto son consideradas? Esa es la pregunta.
Okay, so that's the question about the Waitangi Tribunal, I think. So the Waitangi Tribunal, there are some important points I probably ought to have mentioned before. So one important point about the tribunal membership is that the legislation requires that tribunal members be appointed first with regard to the treaty partnership, and that has generally meant, well, it's generally been assumed that that means there ought to be roughly the same number of Maori and non-Maori on the tribunal at any one time. The tribunal can have up to 20 members plus a chairperson, but they don't hear claims altogether. So they usually hear claims in panels of usually 4 or 5. They're appointed for their particular, they're appointed by government, but they're a kind of independent body. So they're appointed for their particular skills and knowledge that they bring. So unlike in our court system where judges are expected to make decisions based on specifically the evidence that's put in front of them, the tribunal members are expected to bring their own knowledge to the claims that they hear. And so they come from a range of different backgrounds. There are people from the Māori community, people with expertise in, there are Māori elders who are appointed to the tribunal, people with expertise in Māori language and customs and tikanga Māori and those kinds of matters. Lots of people involved in policy and governance in one shape or form, either from a Maori perspective or from the government side of things. There are people who have backgrounds as historians, other kinds of social sciences, geography, those kinds of disciplines are present on the tribunal, as well as lawyers and people with a legal background, and Māori land court judges also sit as Waitangi tribunal members as well. In terms of the number of claims they receive, they've got over 2,000 claims that they've received to date, but the tribunal doesn't hear each of those claims individually. The tribunal groups them together. Often with the historical claims, they dealt with a particular district, and so all of the historical claims in that particular district would be heard together. Or now the tribunal's moving more into focusing on these more thematic kinds of issues, so health or constitutional issues is a claim that's coming up too. And so there'll be a number of different claims relating to those broad themes that the tribunal will group together and hear all together as well. Now, the tribunal does have some very limited binding powers. Mostly it's only able to make recommendations, but there are some particular binding powers in return of some specific parts of Crown land, which has shifted into government-owned companies, state-owned enterprise land, or formerly Crown forest land. And so only in those particular circumstances, the tribunal may make a binding order to have that land returned, but the tribunal has never fully exercised those powers yet. There's been one instance where there has been a recommendation to do that, but it hasn't completed because there's been an alternative settlement negotiated in the meantime, and there's a sort of interim recommendation at the moment that the tribunal's proposing for that to happen as well. So it does have some limited binding powers, but never fully used those
Could I just add one other piece here, that often in New Zealand over the decades, there's been a misunderstanding amongst non-Māori that the tribunal is looking at historical matters that have occurred a long time ago, and they often contest the idea that anyone now should be held responsible for these things. But actually, a great chunk of the work that the tribunal does is about urgent matters, so policy and legislation that's coming up right now. And Carwyn mentioned the COVID-19 vaccine rollout is one of those recent cases where they had to urgently hear that matter, because those are breaches of the treaty that are occurring now. So of the thousands of claims that they have, they've had a time limit and sort of no longer receiving any historical claims, but they do have an abundance of urgent or contemporary matters, potential breaches of the treaty that they need to look into.
Gracias, María. Hay una pregunta muy interesante con respecto a cómo se ha complementado la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas con el Tratado de Waitangi, y si esto ha permitido de alguna forma abrir puertas para expandir esta soberanía compartida. Eso también en virtud de que, como ustedes, bueno, la declaración para nosotros ha sido un instrumento clave para avanzar en las demandas, y por eso quizás sería interesante también la pregunta para nosotros.
Oh, shall I just start, Carwyn?
Sí, la verdad.
I was just going to say that, of course, slightly embarrassingly, I think the New Zealand government was one of 4 that voted against it at the General Assembly, but anyway, have since come around to the idea, given that they had to. We have had an action plan for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that's recently been proposed by a working group, and that caused a great deal of contention. They had a very simple diagram which I thought was excellent, which indicated their thinking of the way, I guess, in which the rights deriving from Te Tiriti or Waitangi would be consistent with some of the guarantees in the declaration. So they drew a circle of a sphere for Māori political authority, and then a much larger circle of the existing Crown political authority, and a small place where these two overlapped. And they said, actually, if we're going to be consistent with the declaration, at what's at the moment a very small area of Māori rangatiratanga, Māori political authority, and there's an over-enlarged sphere of government political authority that needs to be changed to grow the capacity and power and size of Māori political authority to be equivalent with that of the Crown. And that would then make things consistent, our constitutional arrangements consistent with both Te Tiriti and the declaration.
Yeah, and we haven't, this is a very current discussion, as Maria was saying, and because we have mostly used the Treaty of Waitangi as the framework by which we've addressed Māori rights, we're only just really now, with the plan that Maria has mentioned, starting to see the declaration gaining much more visibility in some of these conversations. It has starting to come up and be raised in court cases from time to time, but hasn't formally been relied upon. Usually it's been, the declaration has been used to say, well, yes, this supports these rights which are set out in the treaty, so it's been used to support that. The tribunal has, in one of its reports, gone into some detail in terms of looking at how treaty principles align with the kind of key articles of the declaration as well. So I think we're starting to see a sort of development of this becoming much more a part of the conversation, and the plan that Maria talked about is central to that discussion.
Hay una pregunta también aquí de Antonia Rivas, dice que quisiera consultar cómo pudieron establecer los intereses y principios del pueblo maorí en la Constitución o similar del país.
So, as Maria mentioned earlier, we have an unwritten constitution. So what we think of as our constitution here in Aotearoa is made up of all kinds of different things. There are some pieces of legislation like the Electoral Act and the Bill of Rights Act, which have key constitutional components to them. And then there are a range of other things we might see as foundational constitutional documents like the Treaty of Waitangi. So in many ways, our constitution is relatively flexible, which has pros and cons. It has meant that we have been able to, well, the courts have and are starting to draw on the treaty increasingly as an independent source of thinking about the government's obligations, but also the basis for recognising tikanga Māori law as a source of law as well. And we've seen that constitutional position of the treaty enhanced by the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal, so a recognition that there needs to be some forum for addressing claims based on the treaty. I think we can see as treaty settlements develop and the new relationships are formed with the Crown, that provides another kind of layer, another gloss of the way in which treaty rights might be recognised. And we do, as I mentioned earlier, see some recognition of the principles of the treaty, at least in legislation. So all of those things do provide some basis for recognising Māori rights, some in a relatively constitutional form. But Maria might have some thoughts about this as well.
I was just going to say that, Māori have been consistently advocating for constitutional transformation, but while we wait for that to fully come to fruition, we also have been chipping away at these different areas, trying to make as many incremental changes sort of across the board as we can. And so I know some people think, incremental change doesn't get us anywhere, but actually in our case it has. We've been able to take small steps in many different areas, and that's enabling us to achieve greater input into decision making in various ways. I would also say that, as Carwyn mentioned, with some of the treaty settlements that we've had, which, even though the financial aspect of it in many cases was paltry compared to, what was actually lost, so it's not compensation in that sort of direct sense, but it's enabled some economic power for tribal organisations. And although we might not want a society or a world where economic power buys you greater political power, in our case, actually, the tribal authorities that do have significant economic power are now able to have much more direct, I would say, engagements with government agencies, because they can hire their own staff and their own teams of lawyers and environmentalists and engineers and so on. So that economic power has enabled, to a certain extent, political power also in the way in which they can participate in decision making. So that's a bit uneven across different tribal authorities. Some are still quite impoverished, particularly if they haven't had a treaty settlement and are still on, somebody else's land and haven't had their resources returned to them. So it's a little bit uneven, but that's something we've also seen in our system.
Micrófono, Tiare.
Perdón. Preguntan también si hay algún tipo de fiscalización para infracciones al tratado por ejemplo, si hay algún mecanismo de fiscalización ante violaciones a lo que se estipula en el tratado.
We wish.
Yeah. So the settlement of historical claims involves a financial component to it, but as we've discussed, it's quite small in relation when you compare it to the value of land lost. In terms of the kinds of the recommendations, I suppose, that come out of the Waitangi Tribunal around contemporary policy and contemporary breaches of the treaty, or indeed some of the mechanisms from the courts that where there is a requirement for government actors to adhere to treaty principles. Those are generally, there might be some recommendations about resources being put into Māori programs or those kinds of things, but hasn't tended to, I can't think of any where there's been a recommendation as a kind of using a financial penalty for that. So it tends to be much more focused around process kinds of questions in that space.
Gracias. Ben Walters hace una pregunta, pero prefiero hacerla en inglés porque siento que se me va a perder algo en la traducción, porque se refiere a una campaña de Corero, y ahí podrían profundizar, porque yo, bueno, lo googleé, pero no estoy muy 100% segura. And he asked if, do you feel the normalization of the use of tereo, of the cool factor, cool to Corero campaign, had an influence in treaty claims, or was it a result of the success gained through those legal battles?
I would say that it couldn't be put down to just that, but there has been a growing momentum, and I would put it back to the efforts that Māori have made to create a separate schooling system, basically, in Te Reo Māori. So I've supported Māori children to learn the Māori language, and that's led to a kind of flourishing of the language in various other places through radio, on TV, and then non-Māori have then been interested in some of those things, and that's had a sort of flow-on effect. But at the same time, we've also been pushing for New Zealand history to be taught more in schools. So shamefully, we've had we learn all about other parts of the world, particularly Europe, in our schools, and don't learn in intimate detail our own histories and stories, and particularly our Māori history and what happened here. But that's been shifting, and we now have that kind of rolling out a bit more in schools. And I think part of that is also leading and contributing to shift in thinking about a more positive attitude towards Māori things, and Te Reo. Carwyn might have some other thoughts too.
Well, the only thing I thought I might add was that one quite striking example for me recently, a couple of years ago, around the normalisation of Te Reo Māori, was that we, at the swearing in of our new Chief Justice a couple of years ago, that's a process where there's a special sitting of the court, and the court gets addressed by the Solicitor General and the Attorney General and the President of the Law Society. And in that special sitting, every single person who spoke began and ended in Māori language. So including the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court judge who was swearing her in, including the Attorney General, Solicitor General, President of the Law Society, and the Chief Justice took her oath both in Māori and in English as well. And then that for me was quite an important symbol, because it was taking place in the Supreme Court, in this space which ought to be normal for there to be Māori language used, but up until that point, that hadn't really been something that was normalised there.
Hay otra pregunta que señala cómo se preserva la cultura maori en relación al canto, las danzas y las artes maori. Lo asocia a lo que se mencionó como ejemplo sobre la visión del río. ¿Podría significar a la vez un cruce cultural político a una visión sobre el reconocimiento del derecho al agua?
I think so. There was a really important Waitangi tribunal claim which dealt with issues around cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and intellectual property law, which touches on some of those questions. And one, I think, really important thing that came out of that inquiry was understanding the connection between the maintenance of traditional knowledge and the nurturing of traditional knowledge, alongside connection with land and environment, so that, for example, if you're not able to access the plant materials you need for your traditional medicine because it's on Crown land, it's on Department of Conservation land, and they won't let you get the plant materials you need for that traditional medicine, then you lose the ability to practice the gathering, the preparation of that medicine. You lose that knowledge and ability to transmit it. You also, alongside that, there's a whole lot of knowledge relating to what we'd talk about as karakia, or I guess, well, like prayers that you would say in the preparation of that traditional medicine. So there is a really strong connection between the environment and place and thinking about the maintenance of culture in that sense. And the tribunal explored a lot of those issues. The other aspect that I just thought might be of interest here is, as an example, not from Aotearoa, but from Canada, where the idea of legal personality has been used in relation to an artwork, piece of installation art, which is held by a museum in Canada, but the artists had put this agreement in place with the museum, which reflects on recognizes in effect that the artwork itself holds legal personality, and so decisions around the management of that piece of art, that piece of cultural heritage, if you like, is taken for and on behalf of and in the interests of the artwork itself, not just simply by the museum or even by the artist.
Should I just make some comments then about water, Carwyn? So water is still a very thorny issue here, and just one of the many frustrations, I think, for Maori groups. The tribunal has made some comments on fresh water in two parts of a large report about fresh water, including geothermal waters. And what they've said is that Māori continue to have proprietary rights, treaty rights to water, and have never relinquished, in some places, tino rangatiratanga over specific waterways and things like that. We have had some legislation which has vested the beds of navigable rivers, so larger rivers in the Crown, but smaller waterways, many of those Māori continue to hold tino rangatiratanga over self-determination over in their rights. At the moment, the tribunal really recommended strongly that the Crown negotiate with Māori about this, and they have done some negotiating, you could say, but are still unwilling to budge from their position, which is that no one owns water, which is a bit of a challenge, given what the tribunal said about who does actually own it. The tribunal was quite specific. They said in 1840, when the treaty was signed, it wasn't a fuzzy concept. At that time, Māori had what we would in English call ownership, equivalent to English concepts of ownership. So while we have our own separate discussion about, as Māori, about whether we think of water in a private property sense in the same way that is being described in sort of an English concept is a slightly different conversation that we have. But in terms of negotiations with the Crown, you know, Māori are continuing to assert tino rangatiratanga over the waterways and are not getting very far, I think. At the moment, there are discussions about allocation of water. So one of the proposals is that different parts of the flow will be allocated to different parties. Yeah, I'm not sure where that's really getting to. We have various pressures on this discussion. Some of the big hydro dams that we have, for example, their whole business model is built on the assumption that the cost of the water that they use to generate their turbines and electricity is zero. So, you know, there are implications if there is an allocation for Māori, or if there's better, greater, appropriate recognition of Māori as owners of water, then there are implications for some pretty big, powerful business entities. So I think some of that plays into why the government won't move on it.
Tiare, micrófono.
Sorry. Tenemos la última pregunta y señala que después de la vuelta a la democracia, el gobierno de Chile comenzó con la política de reparación a las víctimas de derechos, por violaciones a los derechos humanos y que ocurrieron desde 1973 en tiempos de la dictadura. Entonces la pregunta es si hay algo similar llevado a cabo por Nueva Zelanda después de las sistemáticas violaciones a los derechos del pueblo Maori. Bueno, dice sin perjuicio de las políticas que se deben implementar en preventivas, de justicia multicultural o de otra forma, pero ¿qué es lo que piensan al respecto de estas acciones o estas medidas del gobierno referentes a las disculpas durante este siglo? O sea, que ocurran actualmente, si es que hay algo similar que haya ocurrido en Aotearoa, y qué piensan al respecto de estas medidas.
So part of what the Waitangi Tribunal claims process and the settlement of the historical claims is about is really addressing some of these particular questions. And in each settlement of historical claims, there will be an acknowledgement by the Crown of breaches of the treaty and an apology for those breaches, and that's an important part of that. So the government does take steps to apologise for historical treaty breaches in that way. There has been some discussion from time to time about whether the Parliament, as the legislative branch of government, ought to also make a statement of apology. I remember the last time I recall that being talked about was in the context of a debate around Māori rights in the foreshore and seabed, where Parliament had just removed a whole lot of Māori property rights. And so some of the discussion was that, well, before you take a step to apologise, it's probably more important that you make sure your actions are not continuing to breach the treaty. But part of what the Waitangi Tribunal does, as well as make findings and recommendations, well, as part of its process, is that it is it does perform the role of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in many ways. So it is an opportunity for truth telling. It is an opportunity for Māori to have their histories heard and put to the Crown, and for the Crown to be to have to account for the actions that it's taken in the past. In that way, at least, in a truth and reconciliation type of forum.
I didn't really have anything to add except to reiterate that point that, you know, for many Māori groups, the apologies are only really genuine if the behaviour changes. And unfortunately, we've often seen very, you know, formal apologies from government, and then immediately after attempts to, in some other area, remove our rights or breach treaty rights. So yeah, that may be a more cynical perspective on it all.
Bueno, esa era la última pregunta en el chat. Queríamos agradecerles la participación. Veo muchos Rapa Nui conectados, lo cual me alegra mucho, muchas personas conocidas también. Así que bueno, Carwyn, María, quisiera nuevamente agradecerles la participación en este seminario. Sin duda, muchos elementos que esclarecen bastante lo que ocurre en Nueva Zelanda con respecto a la experiencia de ustedes, y también contextualizarlo con respecto a la discusión que estamos llevando a cabo en nuestro país, y que también iluminan que existen soluciones plausibles, existen mecanismos que se pueden implementar, y que debiésemos avanzar también más que encerrarnos a la posibilidad, sino que en unirnos para crear mecanismos en conjunto como sociedad. Así que les agradezco mucho esta enriquecedora conversación. Quería también aprovechar a pasarle quizás unos breves minutos a la embajadora Linda Tepuni y posteriormente al alcalde para que se puedan despedir también. Y yo personalmente, bueno, agradecerles por la disposición y por el tiempo dedicado. Gracias. Linda, si estás por ahí.
Sí, estoy. Muchas gracias. Kia ora maururu. Nada más para decir muchísimas gracias, porque yo creo que fue algo súper interesante para todos escuchar lo que ha sido con detalle, ha sido la experiencia de Nueva Zelanda. I want to thank my colleagues, my friend, my fellow New Zealanders there, Maria and Kawa. Kia ora, kia korua. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Very clear. You can imagine there's an enormous amount of interest here in what's been the experience of Aotearoa. You know, I think it's a journey that has a lot of resonance. You know, for all the reasons that we've talked about too. So thank you very much, and great to meet you finally and see you. Having been in touch with you, Carwyn, on email at some point, so great to see you. Thank you, kia ora. Sí, bueno, estamos acá en la embajada para ayudar, facilitar los contactos, como siempre, Tiare, con la convención, y estamos viendo con muchísimo interés el trabajo que ustedes están haciendo, y felicitaciones, porque yo sé que no es nada fácil en este momento. Hay desafíos enormes para la convención, pero para los pueblos originarios en este país también. Muchísimas gracias, Maruru.
Tavana.
Tiare, Maururu, quiero aprovechar también a saludar a alguna familia que están ahí también presentes, a Bene, que lo veo con la Anita María y Orana a la distancia, atento como siempre, a la Ritz. Hola Ritz, también saludándote a ti, a todos ustedes que están ahí presentes. Sin duda, muy enriquecedora alocución e información para nutrir el trabajo de la Tiare, que nos tiene y nos lidera para la nueva constitución y la nueva relación que vamos a tener con nuestro país, con nuestro Estado. Para mí también ha sido muy rica la información. Muchas gracias, profesora Edwin, María. Muy bien, kia korua, aroha, kia orana, kia koe, ki te rangatira o te whenua o Aotearoa. Aroha atu kia koe tako a Linda, Yorana embajadora. aroha kia koe kia korua tātou a maururu o te tātou piri te mahana nei o angani nao te atua. Ka noho riwa nei muri a korua tātou te puna e peira te atua nui nui o te rai. Yorana korua tātou.
Maururu Tabana, bueno, Yorana Korua, Maururu te Maramarama Korua, mo hakapura te ara o tātou te Rapa Nui, Maururu.